Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 233. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Talia Carner about her new historical novel, The Boy with the Star Tattoo. This story combines two real-life events that relate to Israel, but which took place in France. The first is the 1946 Youth Aliya search for Jewish orphans who were hidden in the European countryside during World War II. The other is the Israeli naval action off the coast of Cherbourg in Normandy during the French arms embargo in 1969. In this novel, a woman named Sharon, who is the assistant to an Israeli naval officer stationed in Cherbourg, uncovers the truth about her boss's mysterious past and his connection to the Youth Aliya program over 2 decades earlier. Talia undertook years of research for this book, including interviews with the Navy admiral who orchestrated the Cherbourg naval operation. In this episode, I'll chat with Talia about her writing journey, why she believes her books find their way to her, and how she used drones to conduct some of her research, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Talia Carner, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
What I'd like to do today is start by talking about your new book, The Boy with the Star Tattoo. I should mention, this is your second visit. The last time you were here, we talked about the third daughter. This time we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about The Boy with the Star Tattoo, which is your latest. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Okay. This novel is set in France, but it combines two events that relate to Israel, which makes this very unique. One is, they are both historical, 1946, after World War II, when agents from then Holy Land, then Palestine, were traveling through the countryside in Europe in search of Jewish orphans that were lost, unclaimed for. And the second event, 1969, is an Israeli naval action in Cherbourg, France, when Israel's navy stole its own boat, so to speak, that had been built by its design and paid for, but were prohibited from leaving France because of the arms embargo. Now, I took those two events, combined them in a heart-wrenching drama, personal story of actually a child who had been found in 46 as part of that rescue, which is called Youth Aliya, where those children were brought to Israel. And he became a naval officer and is now serving in Cherbourg, preparing for this, what turns out to be the escape of the boats. And his assistant, who is becomes obsessed with when she discovers that he has a tattoo of a star, Jewish star, the bottom of his foot. And she says, somebody knows something about it. And the book is actually the way she follows a trail of breadcrumbs of clues throughout France in trying to find out what happened. And she's unprepared for what she finds, which is something that people who go in and chase of a story and may regret it, which she has to really deal with that a lot of more questions towards the end when she finds the answers. But these are that story of the boy with a star tattoo.
So I'm curious where it began, like what the spark was for you when you thought, okay, this is maybe what I start building a book around. What was that thing that caught your attention?
In this case was simple. In 2016, my husband and I were driving in Normandy, France, and we passed by this junction, and I saw the road sign that said Cherbourg. And we went on, but I remembered a few things. I remember the film The Umbrellas of Cherbourg with Catherine Deneuve, but I also vaguely remembered this Israeli naval action in 1969. So in the months that followed, I got in a book that had been published not long before, because for over 35 years, a lot of the information turns out was not revealed to the public. But I read about it, and then I mentioned it to on a visit to Israel. I've mentioned it to a friend who is a journalist, and a few hours later, she calls me and she says, Admiral Hadar Kimchi is expecting your call. And I was flabbergasted because I didn't even know he was alive, but I knew from the book that he had been the admiral who executed this operation. He was 89 years old in 2017 when I met him. He's 96-year-old now. And I ended up interviewing him twice at least, and we developed a nice relationship. Then I met him another time socially, and it was really and after the second interview, he opened his flip phone and let me copy the phone numbers of 14 other people relating to this event that were still alive and coherent. And so I started interviewing them, but I had a big problem, and that is I don't write naval warfare. And so I had all of this information. I write about moral dilemmas and human dramas and gut-wrenching emotional, psychological suspense. So I decided to go to Cherbourg, and this time not just pass the intersection, but settle with a knowledge. I had a confidence that once I sit there in Cherbourg, the story would find me. And that's what happened. The story did.
So you did a lot of research before even deciding upon the story to write.
Because the opportunity came to me that I didn't ask for. I just mentioned that to my friend, and here she made those only 2 phone calls as an Israeli journalist with a lot of daring, just called the chief of the Navy. And she said, my friend from America wants to know more about the boats of Cherbourg. So he gave her the phone number of Admiral Kimchi at home. So she called him. So 2 phone calls. And now she has this set up for me, something I had not expected. I was writing my previous novel, The Third Daughter. I really didn't have time for it. And all the people that he gave me the names, I had to choose. Shall I tell them? They were all between the age of 89 and 98. Did I have to tell them, wait 2 years until I have time for you, or put everything aside and interview them? So I did, because that was an opportunity to collect the information that I would not have later on.
Right.
but it was not something I was prepared for. But then I realized by the fall of 2017 that I had all this information. I better do something with it. And as I'm saying, I went to Cherbourg, and on my third day, as I'm sitting there on one of those cobblestone alleys that by now I watched the umbrellas of Cherbourg again. And that film had been filmed only 2 years prior to the arrival of the Israeli group that lived there. 20 men, some with families, lived there for several years. So I was sitting there having coffee in one of those French bistro tables
Mhm.
when all of a sudden I see her, Sharon Blumenthal. And I said, "Oh my God, who is Sharon Blumenthal?" Of course, you don't know who she is because she's in my head. She's a fictional character that had a cameo appearance in the epilogue of my novel called Jerusalem Maiden that had been published several years prior. But it ended that epilogue in 1968 in France. And this young woman, 20-year-old, she's just out of the IDF, where she had been an intelligence analyst. And she brought me to the second story, which I wanted to tell, and that's Youth Aliya, because I knew what happened, that her mother had been an orphan in France before and had brought to Israel and so on. So that led me to the story I wanted to tell, but the character had been there all along in Jerusalem Maiden. But her placement as 1968 is the Israeli Navy is preparing, and she's perfect to be recruited to this job. And
Right.
that's how this story, that moment when I was kind of swirling my coffee in a cup in Cherbourg on a bistro table, is when I saw her, and oh, she appeared. And that was a second moment. As I'm saying, the first time was the road sign, the second
Right.
time. And with her, immediately the story was going to be there.
Well, how nice that she showed up for coffee on that day.
Yes.
And it seems like that was quite a leap of faith to interview all those people about that event, just trusting that a story would come and you could use it all. I imagine that's the opposite of how it's normally done. Usually you have in
Right.
mind what you want to do and you go find all the information you need to fill that out. Here you just were searching in the dark really for
That's true. It's
information.
because I had the opportunity and I was afraid I would never have a chance to interview these people. Some of these people were already, well, for example, I had read in a nonfiction book about the wife of one of those officers she had been in her early 20s at the time that she had been stationed in Cherbourg, and her Friday night dinners were famous, and the French officers loved to come for her matzo ball soup and so on. So her Friday night became like a club. So I wanted to interview her, and I got to interview her. I wanted to tell the story of the families. And I was lucky to also, some of those kids, children of those officers, two particularly stood up. One was 14 years old, who had met Felix Amiot, a character that was very important eventually in my novel, based upon what she told me and other people who had known him personally. But also a kid who had been only 5 when he arrived, and he goes to first grade and they teach him how to write on a slate. Like, I didn't know that the French was so backwards that the first graders were actually being taught on a slate, not to write with pencil and paper and so on. So I wanted to learn more about the families. So I gathered the information. I knew all along that I'm not going to use all of this material. And that's why I focus more and more on the children. And I had others that by the time I interviewed them, they were in their 60s, but they gave me that sense that of being part of this event that is not the military. It's not in Israel. The Navy is part of IDF. So the IDF has the air, sea, land, and intelligence all under one IDF. So they gave me something else, and that's what I wanted in that part, because I wasn't going to go into the ship and look into the communication systems and the navigation, and I learned for the first time about knots and tides. I wasn't going to use that. I wanted and that's where Sharon Blumenthal as a narrator came in very handy, because I could give her jobs. There was also a problem. I found a lot of still on the internet groups of the seamen. My access was to the officers, but seamen who had been part of this, it was the most important event that ever happened in their lives, and still had chat groups on the internet. And I met and I interviewed some of them afterwards. So I couldn't give Sharon, a woman, a job that any of these men alive still had.
Right.
I had to find the areas where she could help. And I found those places where nobody's going to say, no, that's not possible. And I checked it with my source, the admiral, who was always he's a fantastic personality, very soft-spoken, so well admired by everybody. And so he was very helpful as well. But the Youth Aliya was a fascinating story, because I wanted to find out, there was one question that came up in my mind time and again. And it's based upon an experience. A friend of mine, his brother was found in a monastery one day, and by my friend's father had been, after the Holocaust, slept one night in a monastery, and in the morning, when he was about to leave, the monk said to him, there's a Jewish kid that somebody left here. They didn't come back for him. Would you take him? So he did. Eventually he met his wife, and they had my friend David. And so David has this brother who was about 7.5 years older. And that story fascinated me. How many kids were there, and how did Youth Aliya find them? Did those agents go around, knocked on the door of every farmhouse and asked, do you by any chance have a Jewish kid here? Let me take her across the Mediterranean to a country whose language she doesn't speak. And the people who just raised this child for 3, 4, 5 years say to the stranger at the door, sure. Made no sense. Yet it happened. I needed to understand how it happened. So in my novel, I'm following for 3 weeks one such agent to understand, and I learned more about it. It really had to do with the mentality that while many Catholic, like bishops, and there was a major cardinal who did not want to return baptized children back to their families because they were now Catholic, there were others who helped the Jews. There were Catholic priests who gave baptism papers to Jews during the war. And there were people who believed that those children belonged with their people. And that is why they gave the children back, even if it was to an anonymous institution, to a stranger who says, I'm taking this child to the Holy Land. They believe that the child belonged with their people. So that was one answer. The other answer is pretty simple, and it's called money. And Henrietta Sold, who had founded Hadassah in 1911, now in 1940 onward was the president of Youth Aliya. She was a fantastic fundraiser. So these agents were flushed with money to pay to compensate these people for the years that they had spent on raising those children. Now, let's not all think that all these kids were loved and raised in loving homes. There was exploitation. I, for one, I've written several books about what happens, bad things that happen to children who are not well protected. But by and large, they were those people who took the children, the parents who had left the kids with neighbors, with housekeepers, with business associates, thought was going to be for 2-3 months.
Right.
Nobody had imagined what happened. So now these people in every country in Europe, and that's true, all of Europe, even though my story is based in France only, there was starvation all over Europe, all throughout the war. Nobody was spared. I know that in France they ate animal feed in order to survive. So now come the agent and say, let me compensate you for your expenses this past few years, and offered money. That went well. Now, there's always a problem with teenagers. Teenagers have opinions of their own. They may not want to go. There were custody battles between living relatives of teenagers and the families that raised them, that the families didn't want to give them away back, or the teenagers didn't know those family members. They were cousins, yes, maybe, but they didn't want to go. So there were all kinds of situations, and babies didn't even know the names. They didn't know the names of the parents, where they'd come from. So every age group had its own situation. But I'm going through that in the book because I try to stay away from the Holocaust. I try to stay away from the war years as much as I could. And those are shown from a point of view of a seamstress, French seamstress, not Jewish, who is very remote. What she sees, she's uneducated. She sees refugees, but she doesn't get really what's happening. And she certainly does not understand what's happening to the Jews. All she cares about is she knows that the Nazis are going after the Jews, gypsies, and disabled. She's disabled. So she's concerned, oh, they're going for the Jews. They're going to come for me. That's her point of view. So I wanted to stay away from that, but sometimes it crept up, especially there's another phenomenon in France that it's not very well known. There's always like the perception that when the Allies landed in Normandy on Omaha Beach, which is, by the way, not that far from Cherbourg, it's the same kind of on the north shore of France, that the war was over. But that's not the case. The war continued for many, many months with the Nazis fighting on all fronts within France, continuing. But there was something else that was happening all throughout the war years. Within France itself, there were 5 different factions fighting one with the communists, with their loyalty to Russia, not even to France, but then there were the Pétainists, who were the Vichys, and there were the de Gaullists, and so on. Different people had different approaches throughout the war years. I'm not getting into it, hardly just mentioning that it exists. But after the war, they started to settle their grievances against one another while a war is going on. There's a complete chaos, and maybe 10,000 French people got killed by each other as part of the settling of the scores. Why is this relevant? It's because we get to see what happened to a woman who fraternized with a German, and their lot was really horrible. How these women were tortured and hanged. So that is part that we see during as the atmosphere under which the children are being trying to be found, the Youth Aliya. So
Right.
there's a lot of layers.
Yeah. And the character that you created in your naval officer, what did you need for him? Because it's his story we learn about in the book. So what did you decide was important for his story? How his experiences shaped him and led him to where he was when we see him as a man?
Yes, it's interesting because while he is the subject of the book, he is the boy with the star tattoo. He is not a point of view character. We only meet him when he interacts with the woman he hires to work on this project. And then she starts to be a gadfly, she hounds him with questions he doesn't want to answer. Now, what shaped him are two things. What he knows generally about the Holocaust, and he says, I'm not going there. I don't care what happened. Not that I don't care. I don't want to know what happened to my parents. I don't know what happened, and I would never find out. It's all deportation and incinerators. What else do I need to know about it? But it's more important that I help prevent the next Holocaust. So he is totally dedicated to the security of Israel through the security of these boats need to be finished. They are still under construction, and to make sure that they get to where they're supposed to be, to Israel, and to defend the situation. And the situation is very precarious of Israel in the late 60s because the Arab nations had just lost the Six-Day War in 1967. They were all armed by Russia. Israel was the only one armed by France, and now France announced an arms embargo. So while they were licking their wounds and getting ready for the next round, Israel was in a very vulnerable position where even France would not sell Israel the spare parts for the tanks and airplanes that were French made. So it was very clear that the danger is coming, and Israel's defenses are really weak. Navy almost was non-existent, and those 12 boats that had been built in Cherbourg were going to be extremely important. And turns out that's what happened. 1973, Israel was losing on the air, on the ground, and on the air. It won in the sea with these 12 boats. So much so that by the second day, both Egypt and Syria that had come out with their boats trying to fight Israel, they disappeared, went back into their ports, never came out for the rest of the war because they had no way of winning that against those particular ships, boats that called Saar, Saar. So yes, that proved to be true. But back to Daniel, he sees his future in that, and that is his identity is completely attached to who he is as an Israeli, as a naval officer dedicated to his people. And we're not going to do spoilers here, but there are questions of Jewish identity that come up time and again. And we find that to be a part that's quite interesting. Who is a Jew? What does make one a good Jew or a Jew?
So I'm curious how you started down this path, because all of your books focus on or investigate these sort of really important events in our history that not a lot of people know about. So events or organizations or things that have happened throughout the world. What made you decide that these were the kinds of books you were going to write? Out of all the books you could have written, you choose to write books that investigate these sorts of themes. What was it that got you started?
Actually, it's not of all the books I could have written because I can't write a lot of other kind of books. I tried to write a family drama, a small little thing at home type of things that we read a lot, and there are a lot of bestsellers, very well written, about family. I mean, mother, daughter, sisters, so on, wife, husband, those kind of stories. I tried, and within 100 pages, I was already writing the Iran-Contra affair. So it actually totally spooked me, and that's one book that I dropped and I didn't continue. But that was my attempt. It's not that I can write any other book. Those stories find me, and they compel me to write them. So it's one at a time. Every time I finish, I say, okay, my career is over. I don't have another story. And then the next one hits me. And then I realize that I'd known or had been interested in this subject for decades. None of my books, even though they hit me on the head in a moment, as you say, what was the moment that made this happen? I realized how much of it had been already in my head in terms of my interest in the subject. And that's how each book finds me. I don't choose that. It's not a decision that I would write about women's issues, which most of my books have been about women's issues. I, uh, I've been in the world of women's issues for a long time, also my previous career. So for me, those are subjects that are close to my heart that I've been interested in.
Do you find, now that you've written six of these, do you find that the books change you in some way and have affected you personally more so than maybe some others? Do you find now that you're on this journey and you've written all of these, how do you think they've impacted you as a human being?
Because some of those subjects are so emotional. If
Right.
it's child molestation, infanticide in China, sex trafficking of girls, I mean, these are tough subjects. So, first of all, I realized that I needed maturity to even allow myself to delve into such subject. Probably could not have done it in my youth, I imagine. It's just very emotional, very difficult. And the way I write each book is that's natural for me, is to climb under the skin of my protagonist and see the world through her eyes, the sights, hear the sounds, smell the smells, feel the weather on my skin, but mostly feel the emotions. It's very much like a dream. I'm in a trance. And like in a dream, you feel everything very real. It has a little bit more logic. My trance has more logic when I write it, but I literally close my eyes and I type. Literally, I get into that kind of a trance. And it's emotional. That's what I can say about it. And I must say that The Boy with the Star Tattoo has a little bit less of that. It has more of a historical, and again, at the opportunity that had presented itself with this naval story that for me, represented something else. It represented the way in the 1960s, the devotion in Israel for its survival. I didn't know that it was going to happen all over again. When I was writing it, as I'm saying, first researching in 1917, 18, but I was, I'm sorry, 2018, I was back to writing The Third Daughter. I had to pick it up at around 2019 when the other one came out, and then COVID hit. So I was very busy with a lot of Zooms, one of them with you, but my novel continues to develop the story. Now I'm writing the story, not writing, but actually riding the wave of where it's taking me. And as it took me to the Loire Valley, and for a specific reason, because of Chateau Valençay, which was a specific, had a history that I wanted to tie to. But now I'm in the Loire Valley, which I was not familiar with. So I got contacted tour guides and historians, and I had fabulous contacts through them, and sorted out the different villages around this chateau where the rest of the story could take place in regards to the chateau. And in order to finalize my selection, I actually used drones over those villages, because each of them, I needed to know where is the castle or palace or ruins, where's the river, where's the church, where's the plaza, is it high, low? Some are on a river bank, some are above a plain. So I used drones, and that was very interesting to get that. And I got the cooperation of those villages to get those drones. So the story continued. So back to the question, how it changed me. It made me realize that I can come up with new solutions to subjects. I continue to grow with every topic. I continue to grow. And this one in particular, I ended up with 5 trips to France. I would say 3 were absolutely necessary, and 2 were just like cherry on a cake. But one of them was, for example, I was looking for a journalist who had been covered in Cherbourg those events. And I'd seen a video of him from interview 4 years prior, let's say from 2013. So I knew that at least a few years prior to my research, he was alive and coherent. But I knew he must be also well into his 80s. It took me a long time when I finally found him by complete coincidence, when I was interviewing somebody else, and he said, "Oh, you shouldn't be talking to me, you should talk to René Moirand." And I said, "I can't find him." And he says, "Oh, I'm friends with his nephew." Just like the whole research was so many coincidences that brought me. So now I was talking to this journalist, René Moirand, which not only covered everything, he was friends with a lot of those Israelis during those years, but he discovered that the night before the escape, he found out about it, and he did not reveal it, which today a journalist coming across a scoop like this would not do. And he lost it to the BBC, the British one, to a day and a half later. But when I was talking to him the second time, I was in a hotel with my husband. I put it on a speaker because we were traveling in France on another one of those trips relating to it. And I put it on a speaker, and I changed to English because I knew that René Moirand had been educated in Oxford, so spoke English. Obviously, I speak French. Figure that out. And I changed, switched to English so my husband can hear the conversation. And my husband whispers, tell him, this was October 2018. He says, tell him you're gonna come in the spring to see him. So I said, okay. So he invited us for a weekend in his house, which was in the French Alps. By that time, he had obviously years after retirement, and he had a farmhouse in the French Alps. So we flew in for a lovely weekend in the French Alps, which he was fantastic host, and he regaled us with fantastic stories. He had been anyway. I will not get into those his stories, but I had a lot of additional information that I did not really need, couldn't use, but it was very helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hesitate to ask because you may not be able to tell us, but I'm curious if another story has found you now that the boy with the star tattoo is out and on bookshelves. Are you working on one of those other fantastic
Yes,
stories that has found
It
you?
happened to me again. I thought, this is it. My career is over. That's the last book. When it hit me, a story I'm not going to share yet, because when it's so fresh, I feel that if I start talking about it and then I want to change something, I'm saying, oh, you can't change. You already said it's like this or like that.
Right, right.
Some little editor inside my head doesn't allow me, because as if I had committed to a particular storyline. So I would only say that it happens in a country. I woke up one morning as a 17-year-old in a country where I never wanted to be, I never wanted to visit, I had no interest in, but I Googled what's happening with her and I saw this is true. I couldn't believe it. I don't know where it came from. I must have watched some documentary. I don't know where it came to me. So anyway, 2 months ago, I flew over to this godforsaken place for 6 days. I had a good guide. I talked to her ahead of time. She spoke English because I don't speak that language. And she prepared the trip for me, exactly where I needed, and the interviews and the feel of the place where I needed, and it was really, really good. And now I need to sit. I started to write it, but it's building. I don't know where it's going. That's the whole thing about my books, is that I know some authors write an outline, which I envy them. I thought I tried for this one, but I'm completely stumped. I need to take my time for every scene, live through it with a protagonist. I live with it and I experience, and then the next thing happens, and then it develops, and so on, and the emotions. It's just like music. You can't fast forward music, and you have
Right,
to listen to the music in its own pace.
right,
And
right.
that's how the story comes to me, in its own pace.
But there is another one coming, is what you're
Well,
telling
it
me.
takes me 4 or 5 years to write a book, so I'm not pushing myself. That's why I don't have a contract with HarperCollins on the next book. I don't want them to tell me what to write, because they may have some ideas. For example, for years I've been hearing, why don't you write about an Israeli and a Palestinian falling in love? I'm not interested. I don't believe in it. It doesn't touch me. It's not a story that I need to tell. Uh, but so I don't want the publisher to have an opinion about what I write, and I don't want to have a deadline. Uh, but it will come. Now I'm secure enough to know that it will come, and I have a publisher that so far has been buying every book I write. I have a right of first refusal, and they love it every time.
Good.
So
Well, we can be patient. We can be patient and wait for the next one.
thank you. But they are the previous books that people don't always know
Right.
that are, I think some of them are really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I recommend going to my website, and which is my name, taliacarner.com, TALIACARNER. And look, I read the first few chapters of each one of my previous novels, and I guarantee that something will stick.
Right. Right. So that's where people should find you. And all of the other information is available on your website too, I assume, where you're
Yes.
appearing and events,
Yes,
all
I
that sort
have
of
a
thing.
lot. I continue my book tour. My book tours in the past have gone on for 2, 3 years because I love public speaking, and I give lectures about the social issues or historical context of each of my books. So it's not, I don't do a reading, I give an interesting lecture. So I get invited way past the first few months of a book's release. As I'm saying, it can go on for a long time. And for this book, which we are going to, it's going to be now the first year anniversary. I've already booked from the start, will be like 90 in person. And I just got this week a couple more. And I'm talking for large audiences, interest. It's
Right.
not a small thing. But I do Zoom for a book club for those who have read my book and would like to chat about it. I don't want them to feel that they have to have a book group. I'm your book group. Let's get together. And I have those events coming every 5, 6 weeks. Can find that on my website and sign up.
Excellent. Good. So if people want to purchase a copy of The Boy with the Star Tattoo or any of your other books, where can they go to buy them?
And as HarperCollins says, anywhere where books are sold, I encourage independent bookstores where you can order the books. They may not stock them, but they can order them for you. And there's always the online big seller. And Barnes and Noble has been wonderful. I'm in Florida, and here they sold a lot, and a lot, really. There's some of those stores, they had a tremendous amount. Maybe in others, I just don't get the numbers,
Right.
but you can always order them in the bookstores
Good.
and online,
Excellent.
digital, and it's audio as well. So
Good.
all of my, I'd like to say one more thing about libraries. People think that if they order from a library, the author gets deprived of their income. So first of all, we are not deprived of the income because libraries pay for their copies and for the usage. And so I don't know the formula, but the important part about libraries is that they have budgets, and they want to spend the budget before the end of the year on books that their patrons want to read. So please put in your requests for the audio, for the digital, for the print of any book that you would like, and hopefully my books, and so they can stock them. And then other patrons get to read those books because now they will be available.
Right.
And
Right. That's a very
sometimes I
good
walk
point.
into a library and my book, any of my books is in the kind of on the front, the librarians sometimes, depends on the library, but they put some choices of the librarians. So I find my books because my novels are the kind that there are a lot of conversations around them. Some books can be very well written, a boy meets girl, but there isn't much to talk about, while mine have social issues. So there's a lot to discuss, and librarians like to recommend them.
Right. Right. Very good. So a lot of choices for people, and they should definitely check out their local library. Well, Talia, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with The Boy with the Star Tattoo and your work in progress. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that. So,
Thank you.
congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.